Imagine being a pawn in a game you never wanted to play, where your heart is the battlefield and your crown is the prize. For Joanna of Castile, this wasn't a nightmare. It was her reality. While she was reeling from the constant betrayals of her husband, Philip the Handsome, he wasn't trying to comfort her or understand her pain. Instead, he twisted her grief, using her emotional distress as a weapon to paint her as unstable and mentally unfit. All the while, he was shamelessly using her royal bloodline to climb the ladder of power. Then, in 1497, an unimaginable tragedy struck the Spanish royal family. Joanna's beloved brother, Juan, the heir to the entire Spanish throne, died suddenly. He was only 19. The court physicians whispered about the cause. Was it tuberculosis? Or perhaps, as some scandalously suggested, the result of being a little too enthusiastic with his new bride? We'll never know for sure. Juan's death left his pregnant widow as the next in line, but hope turned to heartbreak when she miscarried. The crown then passed to Joanna's older sister, Isabella, who was already the Queen of Portugal. It seemed the line of succession was secure. But within a year, fate dealt another cruel blow. Isabella died in childbirth. Her infant son, Miguel, became the new heir, but he too was fragile. He survived for only 2 years before passing away in 1500. Through this devastating chain of deaths, a brother, a niece, a sister, a nephew, Joanna's life was turned upside down. She went from being a relatively minor princess, married off for a political alliance, to the sole heir presumptive to the thrones of both Castile and Aragon. Suddenly, she was the most important woman in Europe. She was the single link connecting the powerful Spanish kingdoms with the vast Habsburg Empire. Her value on the political stage skyrocketed overnight, and her husband, Philip, he saw this not as a family tragedy, but as a golden opportunity. He realized instantly what Joanna's new status meant. Through his wife, he could now claim the crowns of Spain for himself. His ambition knew no bounds, and his treatment of Joanna became even more calculated, more cold, and more cruel. She was no longer just his wife. She was his key to an empire. In 1501, pregnant with their third child, Joanna made the long journey back to Spain. It was time for her to be formally recognized as the heir by the courts of Castile and Aragon. Arriving home, she was met by her mother, the legendary Queen Isabella I, but this was not the formidable queen the world knew. Isabella was aging, worn down by decades of relentless rule and personal loss. She looked at her daughter, at Joanna, and her heart filled with a growing sense of dread. Isabella saw the desperate, all-consuming love Joanna had for Philip. She recognized it not as a romantic passion, but as a dangerous vulnerability, a weakness that ambitious, power-hungry men like Philip would exploit without a second thought. For months, mother and daughter were side by side. Isabella tried to mentor Joanna, to teach her the hard-learned lessons of statecraft, the art of rulership, and the absolute necessity of maintaining one's dignity, no matter the personal pain. But Isabella's advice, born of stern duty and unwavering faith, offered little solace to Joanna. How could lessons in dignity help a woman whose heart was being shattered daily by her husband's constant, public infidelities? Joanna was trapped in a storm of emotional turmoil, and her mother's counsel felt like a distant shore she couldn't reach. The tension was already thick when Philip the Handsome finally arrived in Spain in 1502, and when he stood next to Joanna's family, the contrast was shocking. On one side stood the somber, devout Spanish court, steeped in tradition and piety. On the other was Philip, with his flamboyant, pleasure-seeking Burgundian entourage. It was a clash of cultures, a clash of values, and at the center of it all was Joanna, torn between her duty to her homeland and her destructive love for her husband. Philip made no effort to adapt. He openly disdained Spanish customs, complaining about the food, the climate, and the serious demeanor of the court. His arrogance was breathtaking. He acted less like a future king consort and more like a conqueror, impatient to claim his prize. This only deepened the Spanish nobility's suspicion of him, and it mortified Joanna, who was desperate for her husband to be accepted by her people. Her parents, Ferdinand and Isabella, watched with mounting alarm. They saw Philip not as a son-in-law, but as a foreign threat to everything they had spent their lives building. The situation was a powder keg, and Philip seemed intent on lighting the fuse. He grew bored and restless in Spain. After only a few months, despite Joanna being pregnant again with their fourth child, Ferdinand, he announced he was leaving. He was going back to his lands in Flanders. Joanna was devastated. The thought of being separated from him was unbearable. She begged, she pleaded, she wept, but Philip was unmoved. His political ambitions in northern Europe were more important to him than his pregnant wife's distress. His departure plunged Joanna into a deep, dark depression. She would spend hours staring out a window, waiting for a messenger who never came. Her grief was so profound that her mother, Queen Isabella, made a fateful decision. She refused to let Joanna follow him. Isabella feared that if Joanna left Spain, Philip would effectively hold her hostage in Flanders, using her as a puppet to rule Spain from afar. So, for Joanna's own protection and for the security of the kingdom, she became a virtual prisoner of her own mother. This period was pure agony for Joanna. Trapped in Spain, separated from the husband she adored, and misunderstood by a mother who saw her emotional pain as a political liability. It was during this time that the stories of her madness began to truly take hold. Stories that were likely exaggerated, if not entirely fabricated, by those who stood to gain from her being seen as unfit to rule. 2 years later, in 1504, Queen Isabella I died. In her will, she made her final, desperate move to protect her daughter and her kingdom. She named Joanna as her successor, the Queen of Castile. But she added a crucial, controversial clause. If Joanna was unwilling or unable to rule, her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, would act as regent. This single phrase would become the legal justification for the next 3 decades of Joanna's life, a life spent in confinement. Isabella's will was a double-edged sword. It confirmed Joanna's right to the throne, but it also gave her father and her husband the perfect excuse to sideline her. The two most powerful men in her life, her father and her husband, now began a ruthless power struggle over Castile, with Joanna as the powerless prize in the middle. Philip, hearing of his wife's inheritance, raced back to Spain, not to comfort her, but to claim his power as King of Castile through her. What followed was a tense and ugly confrontation. Ferdinand, the wily old king, refused to give up control. Philip, young and arrogant, demanded his rights. For a time it seemed Spain might be torn apart by civil war between a father and a son. They used Joanna's grief over her mother's death against her, pointing to her emotional state as proof of her incapacity to rule. Eventually, a fragile truce was reached. Philip and Joanna were recognized as co-rulers of Castile, but Philip had no intention of sharing power. He immediately began working to isolate Joanna completely, surrounding her with his own people and keeping her away from any loyal Castilian advisors. He had won. He was now King Philip I of Castile. But his victory was shockingly short. In September 1506, just a few months after achieving his lifelong ambition, Philip fell ill with a fever, likely typhoid. Within a week, he was dead. He was only 28 years old. The man for whom Joanna had sacrificed everything was gone. The stories that follow this moment have become the stuff of legend, cementing her nickname, Joanna the Mad. They say that in her grief, she refused to be separated from her husband's body. She had his coffin opened so she could kiss his feet. She traveled with his funeral procession for months, a grim parade across the winter landscape of Castile, resting only at monasteries where no women were present. So paranoid was she of another woman stealing him even in death. How much of this is true? And how much is propaganda, spun by her father, Ferdinand, who now saw his chance to seize permanent control? It's difficult to say. What is certain is that Joanna was a woman shattered by loss. She had lost her siblings, her mother, and now the husband she loved with a desperate, destructive passion. Her behavior, whether driven by profound grief or genuine mental instability, gave Ferdinand all the ammunition he needed. He returned to Castile, declared his daughter unfit to govern, and had her confined to the royal palace in Tordesillas, a fortress palace that would become her prison for the next 46 years. Her own son, the future Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, would continue her imprisonment after Ferdinand's death, all to secure his own power. Joanna of Castile, the rightful queen, the link between empires, spent the rest of her life as a ghost in her own kingdom. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is that we may never truly know the answer. But the truth of her final days is far more disturbing, a tale of unimaginable physical and psychological suffering. The servants attending her are terrified. They speak of a smell, a putrid odor of decay that clings to the queen's chambers, a scent of living death. They say her legs have turned black, that the flesh is rotting away, exposing bone. She refuses to be moved, to be cleaned, to leave the squalor of her bed. Her screams are no longer just cries of a troubled mind. They are the raw, guttural sounds of a body in its final, agonizing revolt. To understand how a queen of one of the most powerful nations on earth ended this way, we must go back. Born in 1479 to the legendary Catholic monarchs, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, Joanna was never meant to rule. She was third in line, a brilliant and beautiful princess, destined for a strategic marriage. Described as highly intelligent, with a passion for music and a devout faith, she was a prized pawn on the European chessboard. Her marriage was arranged to Philip, Duke of Burgundy, known as Philip the Handsome. It was a match made in political heaven, meant to encircle their rival, France. But from the moment she met Philip, politics became passion. Joanna fell deeply, obsessively in love. The stories say their attraction was immediate and all-consuming. But Philip was a notorious philanderer. His constant infidelities tormented Joanna, sparking fits of intense jealousy that would become the first seeds of the narrative of her madness. She was in a foreign court, surrounded by rivals, and her only anchor was a husband who publicly betrayed her. Her emotional outbursts were seen not as the reactions of a betrayed wife, but as signs of an unstable mind. Then, tragedy struck. A series of deaths in the Spanish royal family, her brother, her older sister, and her nephew, unexpectedly propelled Joanna to the forefront of the line of succession. Suddenly, she was the heir to Castile. Her husband Philip saw his opportunity. He wasn't just Duke of Burgundy anymore. He was on the verge of becoming King of Castile through his wife. But Joanna's perceived instability was a problem. Her father, Ferdinand, and her husband Philip began a ruthless power struggle, with Joanna as the prize. Both men had an interest in painting her as mentally unfit to rule. They spread rumors, exaggerated her emotional states, and began to isolate her. Her grief and jealousy were reframed as hereditary madness, a dark taint passed down from her maternal grandmother. In 1506, the struggle reached its peak. Philip brought Joanna back to Spain to claim their throne. He and Ferdinand vied for control, each trying to prove Joanna's incompetence. They were tearing her kingdom and her sanity apart. But fate had one more cruel twist. Just months after arriving in Spain, Philip the Handsome, the object of Joanna's obsession and the source of her deepest pain, died suddenly of a fever at the age of 28. Joanna's world shattered. Her grief was profound, epic, and bizarre. This is the part of the story that cemented her legend. Chroniclers wrote that she refused to leave her husband's side, ordering his coffin to be opened so she could kiss his feet. She commissioned a funeral procession that would wander the Castilian countryside for months, traveling only at night, because she allegedly said a widow who has lost the son of her life should not be exposed to the light of day. This macabre journey, with a grieving pregnant queen following her husband's corpse, became the ultimate proof of her insanity. It was the perfect narrative for those who wanted her out of the way. Her own father, Ferdinand, saw his chance. Using her grief as justification, he declared her unfit to rule and had her forcibly confined to the palace fortress of Tordesillas in 1509. He became regent of Castile, ruling in her name. The queen was now a prisoner. For the next 46 years, Tordesillas was Joanna's world. Her youngest daughter, Catherine, was imprisoned with her, her only companion in a life of isolation. The Marquis, who served as her jailer, was instructed to keep her isolated, to ensure she had no contact with the outside world, to reinforce the idea that she was mad. Reports sent to her son, the future Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, described her erratic behavior, her religious despair, and her refusal to eat or bathe. But were these the actions of a madwoman, or a prisoner engaged in the only form of protest she had left? For decades, her existence was a political inconvenience. Her son Charles, who inherited the vast empire, visited her only a few times. He needed her to live, as his claim to the Castilian throne depended on her being the legitimate queen, but he also needed her to be silent and invisible. He continued the policy of her father, keeping her locked away, her name invoked only when politically necessary. The conditions of her imprisonment were appalling. The Marquis of Denia, her keeper, was a cruel man who emotionally and perhaps physically abused her. He used her deep religious faith against her, threatening her with damnation and reporting her heretical outbursts to her son Charles. Denied access to priests and the sacraments, Joanna's spiritual despair grew. She was a devout Catholic in a profoundly religious era, and this spiritual starvation was a unique form of torture. This brings us back to her horrifying final days. Modern historians and medical experts have re-examined the accounts. The descriptions of her last illness, the black, rotting legs, the refusal to be cleaned, the overwhelming smell, are not symptoms of madness. They are shockingly consistent with severe, untreated peripheral vascular disease, likely leading to gangrene. Her legs were dying while she was still alive. The immense pain, the infection, and the sepsis that would have followed could easily account for the screaming and what her captors called her final mad ravings. Imagine the agony, trapped in a room, in a body that was decaying around you, with no one to offer comfort or proper medical care. Her refusal to be moved or bathed was likely not a sign of insanity, but a reaction to excruciating pain. And retired to a monastery, perhaps haunted by the ghost of the mother he had kept locked away. So was Joanna of Castile truly La Loca? Or was she a passionate, intelligent woman broken by grief, betrayal, and a relentless lust for power by the men in her life, her husband, her father, and her own son? Was her madness a convenient label for inconvenient emotions? Her story is a chilling reminder of how easily history can be manipulated. The narrative of the madwoman served those in power, obscuring a far more tragic tale of political imprisonment and horrific medical neglect. The screams that echoed through the halls of Tordesillas were not just the cries of a troubled mind. They were the cries of a queen betrayed, a mother abandoned, and a woman whose body was turned into a living tomb. Her legacy is a testament to the brutal price of power, and a warning that the truth is often far more terrible than the legends we are told. Thank you for watching. If you found this dive into the dark side of history compelling, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories that challenge the official record. Let us know in the comments what you think. Was Joanna a victim, or was there truly a madness in her blood? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay curious.